We have a great program today. We have two senators who have been leaders in healthcare. I'm going to be talking to two of them, and then we have some great speakers and a panel discussion after that. I first want to introduce Senator Richard Burr. He is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's also a member of the Health Committee and the Finance Committee. He's long been a leader in healthcare, dating back to his time in the House when I covered the Medicare prescription drug benefit. He was a leader on that debate. Please welcome Senator Richard Burr. Senator, thank you. The first question I want to ask you is, what is the state of the healthcare system today? What are the problems? I know you've done a report with Senator Alexander on this issue, on cures. We have a revolution in healthcare and in the government trying to facilitate a role, but what are the major obstacles that we face, and can Congress do something about those obstacles?
Well, I'm not sure that it's Congress alone. I think that this is probably demands a coordinated effort between government and the private sector, and I think that at the top of the list for those things that we have to check off is it predictable? Is it consistent? Because what we've got to do is we've got to leverage public money, public research dollars, against private research dollars. We've got to make sure that there's a pathway that's understandable to make it through not only approval, but reimbursement. So this is something that incorporates the NIH, the FDA, CMS, every company, every researcher, and the unbelievable amount of venture capital dollars that are going to really be the seed money to fuel that next upstart that may have a platform technology that addresses 6 or 7 different diseases that we've got.
We have, as you know, an aging population. So legislation that's moving in the House is designed to streamline the process, both the FDA, also to give a lot more money to the NIH, which is something that both Republicans and Democrats have been talking for years. The House draft legislation has bipartisan support. What is the situation in the Senate? Are you waiting for the House to move their bill? And then what will the Senate do on this issue?
Well, the Senate resembles your question, an aging population. So, and I include myself in that. The Senate never moves quickly. I mean, we have a great history of that. And I applaud the House's efforts with the Cures Act. From a standpoint of the volume of what's there, this is going to take a while to try to figure out exactly the path forward, though things can happen very quickly in the House. Senator Alexander and I have been focused primarily on innovation. If I have one personal concern, it's that innovation seems to be looking for another place other than the United States to call home. And if we ever give up innovation in this country, I think we've made a huge mistake, and that's not limited to healthcare, but that's across the space. We're the only place in the country that has a rule of law, and we protect intellectual property. There's a way for somebody to recover as long as they can predict the timeline that it takes to be in the system and the reimbursement that's available to them. If you can't predict those two things, then you've taken private capital off the table to finance innovation, and you will never find enough public dollars, I think, to drive it. So though there's, I think, a willingness to increase funding at the NIH and to make sure that those dollars are spread extramurally and intramurally at the NIH, if you haven't got a functional FDA that's ready for the 21st century, if you haven't got CMS in a mode where they're giving hope of that pathway to reimbursement, then you have a total breakdown of that innovation. We're not first, we're probably last to receive the innovation. It's overseas before it's here. And I'll just point to one little example. It is time for the United States and for the FDA to figure out how we utilize foreign data, foreign applicants' approval for a new product. This is crazy that we could have products that are on the marketplace for 2-3 years in Europe, yet we would discard 100% of the clinical data as it relates to the application here in the U.S. I think that I'm looking for how do we collapse the development time, how do we collapse the review time. I'm not talking about changing the gold standard, but collapse it down to where there's a great understanding of how long it's going to take to go from the bench to to the patient.
You've been involved in many healthcare debates, and certainly this year we saw a major breakthrough as far as bipartisanship on healthcare on the Medicare doc fix, which had been lingering for well more than a decade. So I want to ask you, do you think that this can be done this year, that the Upton to get draft legislation or some version of it can pass the Senate this year? Because that's what Chairman Upton wants. He wants to get a bill to the president by the end of this year, if not sooner.
Well, let me just again commend Diane DeGette and Fred Upton. I think that the Senate will produce our own bill. That's a bill that I expect we would have in conference. I won't tell you what the timeline is because I don't know. But whatever we come out of the Senate with, I think we'll have to check the boxes I talked about. That we look at private sector capital and they say it's predictable now. We understand how long it's going to be from bench to patient. There is a pathway for us to achieve a reimbursement. And yes, the pieces are in place at FDA, the talent that's needed to address 21st century breakthroughs. And I think that's what we're looking at. You got to remember why this is driven. It's not just driven off of the obvious need, which is patients. It's driven off of the fact that the cost to maintain disease is more expensive than we ever dreamed. And I would tell you that we've got to jam through this maintenance era that we're in, and we've got to get to cures. And we're not going to hit cures across the board, but if you hit cures in one of the big 5 diseases from a cost standpoint, you've now enabled the baby boomers to sort of get over that the top of the wall, and we're on the back side of that where we can take the advantages of some of the technologies. My hope is that a year from now, 2 years from now, we're more seriously talking about platform technologies that enable us to treat 5 or 6 different things from the same platform. This takes a whole different reviewer at the FDA, and I commend Janet Woodcock and the device folks, Jeff Scherer. They understand it, and it's incumbent on us to make sure that they've got the resources needed not only to recruit, but to retain the talent that they need. So again, I see this as a group effort.
You mentioned cost, and that's something that a lot of people have said, listen, we need to invest early on to prevent cost on the back end. But that's going to be key also in the score of this bill, because this legislation costs money. And how big a factor will CBOs cost? Because as you know, there's been some frustration with CBO that some lawmakers have said they don't recognize the savings on the back end. How is this legislation, whatever final form it takes, going to be paid for?
Well, one, let me say that with the Budget Act this year, dynamic scoring is in the Budget Act. But let's just say for a minute that it wasn't. If you could predict what the cost savings is, and I think you can on certain diseases, wouldn't it be novel if we financed up front and we paid for it in part with the savings in the out years? And I think that's a novel thing that we've got to begin to look at. We've got to begin to talk about. I'm not sure that Congress is ready to have that debate. But I clearly believe that we know enough about the cost of Alzheimer's to predict what it's going to cost in year 10 through 20. And if we affected a change in the number of people that had either progression of Alzheimer's or got Alzheimer's to start, then it would be a fairly significant amount of money, and it wouldn't be a wish, a hope, and a dream. This would be something real that you could touch from a standpoint of savings. So I think we've got to look at all the novel ways that we can finance research, but it doesn't work, Bob. It does not work if you don't make the changes at all of these places. If reimbursement's not predictable, if we haven't collapsed the timeline for approvals, if you're not driving the research in a multi-facility way, then just throwing more money into it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have the impact to the U.S. healthcare system and to the world.
And do you think that those efficiencies should be worked into legislation on this issue?
Well, I would only make this point. To pass legislation that says, here's our goal of where we want to get to. If you're not changing these pieces or making sure that they're ready for it, then you're not going to get to where you intended to get to. So I think that they're absolutely crucial that there be a partnership on this. Whether that partnership requires a legislative path for everything, I don't think that's the case. But it means we've got to be able to check the box and say, we've accomplished this, we've accomplished this, we've accomplished this. Then let's challenge science and let's challenge great minds to go to the bench and produce the products with the predictability of knowing that you can make it through the goal line if, in fact, you've got an answer to a problem. Again, I want to stress this. If you look at the capital markets, especially the venture capital, and you say, we're ready to go, and they're saying, no, you're not, there's a pretty good indication.
As far as moving forward, you have, of course, the ongoing debate on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. That's obviously at the Supreme Court now again. If the legislation moves forward in the Senate, as a lot of people are hoping, can this legislation avoid the partisan politics of Obamacare? With amendments, I mean.
Well, I don't see us moving between now and July. And I think King v. Burwell will be decided by then and announced. And I wouldn't predict today what the pathway is forward with that. But I think anything in healthcare is affected by the Affordable Care Act. Some in a big way, some in a small way. The big way is the coverage side. The small way is the cost. I mean, to be real honest. And I think anytime you've got the lack of clarity as to what the rules are going to be 12 months, 18 months ahead, then you've got a reluctant private marketplace to invest in it. I think there are ways for us to create certainty through federal agencies, whether it's in the approval times or whether it's in the reimbursement pathway. You can provide certainty that's not impacted by the Affordable Care Act, but it takes a pretty definitive move on the part of the agencies.
It's interesting. This issue has been a lot less partisan than other aspects of healthcare. In particular, in the last presidential race, Newt Gingrich during the primary was talking about doubling, and is still talking about doubling NIH's budget. Do you think that the president is going to have to take a leading issue on this to push legislation to get done in his final 18 months?
Listen, I think the president deserves some credit for launching precision medicine. And I think it fits in this same basket of what the House and the Senate's attempting to do. I think the most important thing is to get it right. I think we only get one shot at getting this right. So call me a creature of the Senate. I'm not as concerned with the speed with which we write it. I am concerned with the accuracy with which we actually achieve in the legislation. So I think that Speaker Gingrich would probably agree with me. I'd love to increase the NIH budget as well. But I wouldn't expect a different outcome if, in fact, we didn't see these other pieces change. And I think when you talk about development of new therapies, what I suggest to people is you've got to look at the human face on the other side of the issue. If you can't see the human face, then this is not an issue you want to get involved in. And one thing that drives me all the time is that there are many Americans that when they get sick, right now they have a choice between nothing and nothing. And I think inherently in the U.S. there ought to be a choice between nothing and something, or something and something. So I think we're going to have to rethink our whole approval process, and at what point do people have the option to do experimental drugs? And again, this is a whole different debate, but I think that it's important in the overall context of healthcare to say we're going to be as compassionate, and we're going to allow people to step out. We've got new therapies where those options might be beneficial to a patient today. but we don't allow, the system doesn't allow one to say voluntarily, I want to participate, because we haven't proven everything yet. My hope is that if we've got everything in place and we've got a new development process that's predictable and consistent, maybe we inject that option where somebody who has nothing and nothing has nothing and something now.
Last question, you mentioned the human face. When you talk to constituents about this, whether there be medical providers or patients in the search for innovation and cures and trying to get better, what are you hearing on the ground?
Listen, I think the U.S. healthcare system suggests to everybody that if you can find a doctor that will write a script, you have a cure to whatever ails you. I'll let Dr. Cassidy address that in a more educated way. But listen, patients across the world are betting on innovation out of the United States. It may be the difference between life or death. It may be the difference between a comfortable rest of their lives or an uncomfortable way. And what I see standing in the way of that is it's very fixable. But Washington is a creature of habit. You know, I remember when I first got to the Senate and I asked, this phone of mine doesn't even have last number redial. Can I get a new phone? And the answer I got was no. And I said, why? And they said, because this is a phone we've had for 30 years. Well, I dare say that we've got federal agencies, a lot of them in the healthcare space, that the reason we do it the way we do it today, is because we've always done it that way. Yet if you look across at the impact that science and breakthroughs have had, you don't find anything in the private sector that resembles how we do it in the public sector. And part of this is going to be attracting talent that has actually been in the private sector, been on the academic bench, done it differently, looked at different ways to structure trials. At the end of the day, the burden of proof is still the same thing, safety and efficacy. But to believe that we can't do it faster and cheaper and still be safe and effective just means that we're not allowing people to come in and to present an application that way and to allow them to go through a process designed that way.
Senator Burr, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Good to see you.
I want to introduce next speaker, Senator Bill Cassidy, also a doctor, serves on the Health Committee. Please welcome Senator Cassidy.
Hey, Bob.
Hey, doctor. How are you?
I'm good, man.
Well, let's start with the first question, because Senator Burr deferred to you. What do you hear on the ground?
As regards what?
As a physician, as a senator, with the state of the healthcare system, specifically in the search for cures for major diseases?
It depends upon whom you speak with. If you're speaking to an oncologist right now, it's an exciting time because there are drugs coming forth that are giving hope to those who formerly did not have. I'm a hepatologist, a liver specialist. Hepatology, we're curing hepatitis C. Wow. You cannot imagine how, well, I finished my fellowship in '89. About 1988, 89, we stopped calling it 9A9B and called it hepatitis C. For so long, we knew it existed, but didn't even have a diagnostic test. Now we are curing. So there is, in that field, tremendous promise. And then you look at Alzheimer's and dementia, and there's almost despair because there has been so little innovation. And a disease which is affecting, looking around this room, our parents, our grandparents, and yet so far medicine has been able to do not very much. If you speak to that person, there's not quite so much hopefulness.
I want to ask, because a lot of people have been writing and reading about what the House is doing and the bipartisan effort, as I mentioned, led by Chairman Upton and the Energy and Commerce Committee, which you formerly served on in the House. Where do you see this effort going on in the Senate? We have 2016 fast approaching, a lot of presidential candidates jumping in the race. So the conventional wisdom in this case, I think, is right. It's tough to get legislation done in a presidential year. So what is going on in the Senate?
First, I think the same focus that is in the House is also in the Senate. If you will, 21st Century Cures has 3 points. It is to make sure that patients are preeminent. Secondly, it is to take away that thicket of administrative bureaucracy and lack of appropriate allocation of resources that is so characteristic of the federal government. And thirdly, it is to provide more resources. Now, if we're to say to the people in the Senate or the people on the campaign trail, we want to put forward a bill, whichever party you're in, that makes sure that patients are preeminent, that the federal government is more nimble, and that more resources are available to address issues such as Alzheimer's and dementia, everybody, both parties, is going to volunteer for that. So I'd prefer to be optimistic and say that the House and the Senate can continue to work forward on these mutual goals. Despite it being a campaign year, this is something that Americans should want. Why wouldn't you?
Sure. Do you see something, Senator Burr said he doesn't anticipate anything moving in the upper chamber anytime soon, suggesting anything would probably be in the fall. Do you think that's a likely scenario? If the House effort is successful, certainly it could pass within the next month or so. Do you think the Senate then acts in the fall?
Well, it's a little bit of a process question, but I'll address it as best I can. Certainly we have things in the queue, and it's going to line up, but we've had hearings upon this. And so it seems reasonable fall would be a timeline. Now, I've learned in life that oftentimes things slip, okay? So it might slip a little bit.
Right.
On the other hand, I'd like to think that's not because of a delay, just because there's a lack of interest, rather that because there's so much potential here, as Senator Burr said, you want to get it right.
As far as does it have to be bipartisan in the Senate? It's actually, as you know, the House is kind of a partisan body, but they are working together on this. Not all Democrats are on board, but certainly key Democrats are. Does any successful effort, especially because it's a divided Senate, not 60 votes, as Democrats had years ago, will Democrats be part of the conversation?
Why wouldn't they be? Again, not knowing anybody's political persuasion, but if you say that we want to make patients preeminent, that we want to make sure that the federal government is more nimble and more accountable and more transparent, and that we're going to create more resources in some fashion to address diseases which are the scourge of some populations, why wouldn't you? Number one. Number two, I think the president's health care law, Obamacare, is a cautionary tale. If you force something through, even if you could, if you do, on a partisan basis, it continues in rancor, and its effectiveness is somewhat diminished. And whatever benefits the others' ideas would have brought are ignored because it was so partisan. So I think there's also the cautionary tale of the Affordable Care Act. So for both a positive and perhaps a negative reason, I think it will absolutely be bipartisan.
You mentioned government efficiency. As a doctor, what do you see, what agencies need to be closely watched, let's put it that way, as far as also oversight of how NIH would spend billions more in money?
Well, first, if you're speaking about which federal agency needs more oversight, I would say they are legion. So, I mean, federal bureaucracy almost inherently, again, if you say nimble bureaucracy, you're thinking, what? There's no such thing as a nimble bureaucracy. And I think the bureaucracies themselves would kind of acknowledge this. They are actively engaging, whether it's FDA or NIH, into alternative ways by which they can both regulate but also recognize promise, and by recognizing promise, enhance that promise. So on the one hand, there's a problem. On the other hand, I think the agencies are stepping forward to address. But then to continue in that vein, I think it is the role of the legislative branch to look and say, what can we do that creates a more efficient and a more accountable and a more effective federal government? And when it comes to drugs in which you see the approval time is sometimes lengthening, the expense to approve increasing, and we sometimes have a sense that it is diminishing returns for the amount of extra money that is required, hopefully we can make that, as Senator Burr said, a more effective process, less expensive, more quicker to the medicine cabinet, if you will.
Who do you see, as Senator Burr mentioned that the Senate is going to be doing its own bill. Who do you see as the major players in this discussion in the fall or whenever, if it slips into next year? Is it Chairman Alexander? Is it Chairman Hatch? The jurisdiction is Energy and Commerce in the House, and as you know, there's not one health committee. There sometimes can be several. Who do you think is going to take the lead on this?
Well, the Health Committee has jurisdiction over both FDA and NIH.
Right.
And Senator Alexander has been a very effective and a very active chairman. Again, and among his activities is reaching out to the ranking member, Senator Murray. So I absolutely see that he's, if you will, the prime mover here.
What about the pay-fors? Because that could involve the Finance Committee. Is that the biggest obstacle here of how it would be funded, how it would be offset, especially with the budget caps in place?
You're asking these questions of Senator Burr, and that is an ecosystem type answer. If you look back when under Gingrich, that the NIH funding increased so rapidly, was actually a period of rapid economic growth. And to put a plug in for an editorial I just published with another fellow, Louis Woodhill, in the Wall Street Journal, we point out that in that period of time, there was 3.5% annualized growth of GDP. And there was so much extra money in the federal government that they could both dramatically increase funding of the NIH, but also balance the budget. It really was a time of increased economic growth, curing many ills. So one of the problems now is under the Obama administration, we've had annualized growth somewhere between 1.3 and 2%. Now that's kind of what Bangladesh has. So you can't separate our ability to fund priorities like NIH from the overall state of the economy, nor from, for example, the increase of mandatory spending, putting pressure on everything which is discretionary. So you can't separate this from the overall context of the federal budget. If we have more economic growth, which is a separate discussion but intimately related to this, we'll be able to do a lot of things.
Going back to your background as a physician, what do people in Washington, D.C. don't get, what do they not get about the medical field?
Much.
We've got a couple minutes left.
One example, electronic medical record, which is going to be so intimately involved in this, because people coming up with personalized medicine are going to take large data sets, they're going to take some sort of kind of picture of who this data set relates to, and then they're going to take a genetic code which relates to the medical record and the picture, and then they're going to take the medicine, and they're going to interweave this all to find that cure for that person, which is so personalized. It may work for one person in this room and not for the rest, but for that one person, it makes all the difference in the world. Isn't that wonderful? But the person who's filling in that data right now is spending, on average, according to Epic, an extra 13 minutes per interview to fill in charts. ICD-10, I was just talking, ICD-10 has a code for being sucked into a jet engine. And they actually have a code for the second time you are sucked into a jet engine. And we laugh. But that is the code. And by the way, you can make it either right or left. So you're clicking. You're not seeing a patient. You're not looking into the eyes saying, I just have given you a diagnosis that you have cancer. I am looking at you right now to make sure that you register, that you understand that this is not a death sentence. This is something for which there is hope. And there's hope because there's new. Now, I can't get that feel for how you're reacting if I'm clicking, told patient has cancer of the right breast, and maybe in lymph nodes. Click, 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 click. There's something being lost here that bureaucrats have no clue about. And you will not have a clue until your wife has breast cancer and you go and you're devastated and you need that physician with all her empathy to explain to you both why there is hope. Washington doesn't get that at all. And that is awful. So anyway, I could go on, but that's a nice start.
Well, last question. Are you optimistic a bill can get done, signed into law this Congress?
Nothing is ever accomplished by someone who is cynical. Now, you don't want to be Pangloss and be kind of, oh, yes, I'm optimistic because I'm optimistic. But we have huge issues. We're spending $200 billion a year on Alzheimer's dementia. You throw in ALS and and Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases, it could be $300 billion a year. $300 billion a year in a zero-sum budget where if we're spending it here, we're not spending it there. So with that sort of imperative, I am optimistic because this is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue. It is an international issue. And it is incumbent upon us to find the solutions that benefit both those Americans, both the patient, the society, and implicit in that is America's belief in the ability of the government to do something positive. In this case, I think that implicit belief is, again, an imperative.
Senator, thank you for
you,
joining
Bob.
us. Appreciate it. Please, thanks for that. I want to introduce our next speaker to give you an industry perspective. John J. Castellani is the president and CEO of Pharma. Please welcome John Castellani.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I also want to thank Senators Burr and Cassidy for their frank discussion and for Bob's great questions in driving that discussion forward. You know, we'd all like to recognize the lawmakers in the House and Senate and their bipartisan work that they are doing with stakeholders and patient groups and others to accelerate the discovery and the development and the delivery of new medicines for patients. And one of Pharma's most important roles is that of a convener. And this morning we'll hear from Jeff Allen, from Margaret Anderson, from Mark Booten, and Teresa Mullen to talk about their perspective on this very, very important subject. We'd like to bring people together and get the ideas together because it can and help improve our outcomes. It's representative of what we do as an industry. We bring medicine to patients to improve their outcomes. And Matt Ellefson is such a patient. Matt lives in South Dakota, never smoked, and he was diagnosed with advanced non-small cell lung cancer in 2009. At that time, his doctors told him that he had about a 5% chance of living another 5 years. Last week, 6 years after that diagnosis, a very healthy, marathon-running Matt was in Washington and sat down for lunch with my team and me, and it was really terrific. Now, you may have seen Matt around town, if not in person, then in our campaign. You've seen him at Reagan National Airport and or in publications and on websites like The Hills. Matt is why I do my job. Matt is why researchers who discovered the medicine that helped beat his cancer into remission do theirs. Matt is why the people at NIH and FDA and all of us in the ecosystem do their jobs. It's why their vigorous discussion about speeding more potential treatments and cures through the drug discovery pipeline is so valuable, and it's bringing these people and these ideas together. These collaborations are crucial because as the discussion on the 21st century cures demonstrates, what we do as our industry is different than what NIH does. But NIH is an essential part of what we do. They play a critical role in supporting the basic research that provides the new ideas that transform medicine when it's translated into new therapeutics. Our industry then does its job in the discovery and the development and the delivery of those novel medicines. And we do that with a deep and consistent investment. Our members put more than $51.2 billion into research and development last year. That's a new record, and it's the biggest R&D investment of any industry in the United States and in the world. And this matters a lot because it takes now $2.6 billion and at least 10 years to research, develop, and deliver a single potential new medicine. In less than 12% of the candidate medicines that make it into a phase 1 trial will ultimately be approved for use with patients by the FDA. And those are difficult odds, but they're not as difficult as Matt Ellefson's. He's why we do it, and he's why we're all here this morning. You know, these are two essential components of progress: the federal government's expertise in basic science and a global industry's depth and breadth and our ability to scale. And it's why we announced the Accelerating Medicines Partnership last year. The AMP project, Accelerating Medicines Project, is a collaboration between pharma, 10 of our member companies, the NIH, and a number of nonprofit disease groups. It harnesses those diverse groups' scientific muscle to fight elusive diseases like Alzheimer's and lupus. It's the government and industry doing what they do best and toward a common goal of getting more medicines to more patients faster. And that's why more than 500 new medicines have been approved by the FDA since 2000. And right now, more than 7,000 are in the global development pipeline as we sit here. But that's not enough. We need more. After all, as both senators referred to, the cost of Alzheimer's alone, which will increase from $226 billion in 2011 to more than $1.1 trillion a year in 2050, is enormous. The burden of the disease, the financial burden, the burden on the caregivers and the patients themselves will continue to grow at this enormous rate unless we find new treatments that can delay the onset or slow the progression of this disease. The number of Alzheimer's patients will increase from 5 million to nearly 14 million by 2050. But, as Senator Cassidy said and Senator Burr said, if a new treatment could be discovered that could just delay the onset of the Alzheimer's by just 5 years, you could save as much as $367 billion a year just by deferring it for 5 years. And think what we could save if we were able to find a cure. The whole healthcare ecosystem has to work together for real and meaningful change to happen. We can't pit one side against the other. It'll take even more. Even with that, this is going to require creative thinking, aggressive thinking, and indeed radical thinking if we're going to be successful. But unless we do that, we are not going to be able to achieve the great promise that the science has presented us. So thank you all for joining us this morning, and I look forward to hearing the next panel with the terrific panelists that are there. Bob, thank you.
Thanks, John. I next want to introduce our panel. We'll have 4 people. It'll be moderated by Elise Viebeck, who is with The Hill and is a healthcare expert in her own right. The panel will include Jeff Allen, Executive Director, Friends of Cancer Research, Margaret Anderson, the Executive Director of Faster Cures, Mark Boutin, CEO of the National Health Council, Dr. Teresa Mullen, Director, Office of Strategic Programs, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. Please welcome the panel.
Any order. Flexible this morning. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thanks to our audience members. I'm excited to talk about, first, the problem of defining endpoints when we talk about patient input in drug development. And Jeff, I wanted to start with you with a perspective from the cancer community. Could you talk about the problem of finding those outcomes that are really going to matter to patients as opposed to clinicians?
Sure. So I think historically the cancer community has actually done a pretty good job in terms of looking at alternative endpoints to measure signs of efficacy or potential toxicities early on in drug development, and that's the reason that you're seeing some of the advances in the pipeline that were referred to earlier by Senator Burr and Senator Cassidy. One challenge that I think is not unique to oncology, though, is to try and find ways to better ascertain what is actually happening to a patient throughout their course of treatment. And that's very difficult, particularly for debilitating diseases where the patient may not be able to communicate as sufficiently for themselves. And in particular, not only in terms of dealing with the burden of their disease, but there are so many other things that are impacting an individual who either has just been told that they have been diagnosed with cancer or has been fighting it for quite some time. There are just so many other factors that go into that than trying to understand what any one treatment is contributing to their care. And it makes it very complex in order to streamline efficient clinical studies to assess those endpoints, to assess those experiences, which may be very different even across one single type of cancer.
Sure, and it seems like there's also a basic issue that patients, if they're in the course of a disease and they can participate in a clinical trial or in some kind of focus group, that means that they're feeling well enough to do that in a way, and that affects the data, doesn't it?
That's right, and I think it's difficult for the average patient to find those opportunities to participate. And I think that creating those opportunities is a major part of many initiatives underway, some of which I know Teresa will talk about in greater detail today, some of which are being proposed in the bills that were referred to earlier in today's discussion, of trying to create additional opportunities for people to participate at all levels, not only in the formal sense of a clinical trial assessing an experimental new drug, but also even as a part of their routine care, that they are able to have opportunities to provide feedback, both better to their physicians. We see the interest there on behalf of patients. They're doing this with each other. It's just not as well coordinated as it might be able to be in order to provide this information to the larger healthcare system in order to improve decision making as a whole.
Sure. Teresa, I want to go to you. How do you think that the patient-focused drug development initiative is going so far? And what do you see as the challenges to gathering data in a rigorous way?
I think it's going extremely well. I think we're learning far more than even we hoped we would. Patient-focused drug development, and as we term it at FDA, is a commitment that we made as part of this 2012 reauthorization of the user fee program. And the goal was to hear from patients, not to have meetings. We committed to have at least 20 meetings, each in a different disease area. And the meeting is for patients and their families. And FDA is there to listen. And so we spend the entire time, and these are several hours long, and we focus on two major themes. One is, what is the disease impact on your life? What are the most important aspects of the disease to you in your life? And what are you doing, and what are you taking to treat it, and how well is that working for you? And we have asked our various review divisions, we have 16 different review divisions, they're sort of organized by disease to help us in identifying, and we had a public process to identify which diseases. But across the spectrum, we've done 14 so far, and I think we'll be doing well more than 20 before the 5 years are up. But we are really learning some very powerful things from patients. We have our review divisions, our medical doctors are there, and they're gaining a lot of insight. And so what we're learning is that patients have genuine expertise that's unique. I mean, they're technical experts of a kind in their disease area, and I think we see we need to listen to them a lot more, and they're telling us that in general they need to be listened to a lot more by perhaps others in the system as well, and they have a lot to offer in terms of telling us what it's like, what matters to them. They're telling us that their chief complaint, for example, is often not captured in development programs, that we're often not able to bring in this information. And there are very good objective measures of disease progression or progress. We wouldn't want to not have those endpoints, but we see a tremendous value and enrichment that we need to add by bringing in more of the patient's perspective. And so just getting that input through these several hours long meetings is very valuable, but we want to go beyond that, and we see bridging from these meetings to developing more systematic endpoints that really are capturing exactly what the patients tell us matter to them. We had a meeting on functional GI disorders yesterday, and we heard again from the patients who have that disease, or that spectrum of disease, that using the words that they use to describe what their experience is very important, because that's the accurate way to describe what they're going through. And there's very consistent language that's used by patients with a given disease. So capturing it in a way that's meaningful, that can become evidence that we can then use in trials, maybe as a primary area where it's a symptomatic disease, or maybe in conjunction with other endpoints, but that we can really enrich what we are able to collect and measure the benefit of a therapy, but also what it's like to live with a therapy. So for example, with cancer patients, It's not just the efficacy of the treatment, but the toxicities and the toleration of the therapy that has to be captured as well. And they tell us that's very important to them. So capturing what it's like to live with the disease in a continuing way seems important.
Sure. Mark and Margaret, I was hoping you could offer your perspective on how that initiative is going and the patients that you interact with, if they come out of those meetings or similar kind of programs, how do they feel and what difference does it make to them?
Absolutely. So hats off to the FDA, Teresa and her leadership for what has been accomplished thus far. I think if you haven't had a chance to go to one of those meetings, I would encourage folks to go check them out because what Teresa's describing is it is a very powerful environment where you're listening to patients and hearing about, what are their perspectives. I think that what we're seeing right now is really the sort of tip of the iceberg in terms of the acknowledgement of that patient preference information. We're calling it at Faster Cures the science of patient input. I think it goes, farther than what Teresa and the FDA have begun, and I think that there's a lot of appetite for that in the 21st Century Cures process and beyond. And perhaps into PDUFA. I think that industry, there's a science behind this that they have been working on. I think that all of this is really kind of a call to action for the entire community. To your point about, let's take oncology therapies, I have a dear friend who's battling triple-negative breast cancer, and she's in an early clinical trial. The mouth ulcers that she, had from her therapy, which were, affecting the cancer, which is what she wants, were intolerable. So that's the kind of information that we're going to have to get to some sort of granularity. And, the FDA is in a position where they can't just take a lot of random subjective data. So I think that the journey that we're all on together is to try to figure out what is the data that we need, how do we put it into, a drug development process, a regulatory process, and then, I know Mark will talk more about how do we inclusively engage the patients. But I don't see us going backwards on this. I think that the future is very bright in terms of doing all of this work. It's just characterizing it and coming to consensus and agreement. And I think we'll talk more about the burdens that a lot of this places on the regulatory process. How do we pay for it, and where do we go from here on that?
Right, Mark.
So 2 thoughts I would add. First, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and also a shout out to FDA and Teresa as well. In PDUFA 4, there was a lot of anxiety in the patient community that so much of the focus was on safety and not on developing treatments that met the needs of patients. And as part of that agreement, there was language put in that said that FDA would engage with stakeholders, in particular the patient community. And in the lead up to PDUFA 5, we had a number of conversations with FDA, Teresa in particular, and so we really wanted to get at this issue. We felt that the patient perspective was not being heard, not just in the regulatory process, but in the drug development process writ large. And we wanted to change that. And so we came up with a concept of having these 20 meetings, and they've been routinely blasted as ineffective and not meaningful. And I'm here to tell you they were tremendously effective. I think people had expectations that somehow it would lead to new treatments being approved based on those meetings. That was never the intent. The intent was to drive a cultural shift and to cause people to realize that the patient perspective and the experience and the expertise that they could bring to the table was being missed in the discussion. And you all heard Teresa speak right now and talk about how much information they've got, how that has transformed the culture of FDA to say, we need to figure out a better way to do this. It's also transformed the biopharmaceutical sector where every major company is hiring a chief engagement officer. There is a recognition that we need to do this. And one of the things I often say when I talk about this issue is, how many people in the room have an Apple phone? Raise your hand, please. How many of you have Samsungs? A few of you. You guys are the innovators. I also like to ask this, because it's usually just Teresa. How many people have a BlackBerry? Oh, there are a couple of you. So somebody else who works for government there.
Or financial services.
Security. I say that because, at least for Apple and Samsung, they will not even change the color of the device without engaging the end user before they make that decision. And when it comes to the development of medicines, we don't engage the end user until phase 3. That makes no sense. And virtually every company has spent $1 billion developing a product that didn't answer the problem that the patient had. Largely because they went to researchers and doctors who said, we think this is what is important to patients, and they got it wrong. And in every meeting the FDA has had, everybody has had their assumptions challenged, where they came in thinking they knew what was most important to that population, and they walked away going, I got it wrong. We need to engage to understand what the need is. And to what Jeff mentioned earlier, it's not just what is important from a clinical perspective. It's how you live your life. It's what's going on in your life. All the social determinants of health, the geography, culture, religion, all of those things have huge impacts on what you're capable of doing. And they're not accounted for in the delivery system, and they're not yet accounted for in the development of treatments. We need to look at what's important to patients. That's not a substitute for what happens in terms of research or the provider perspective, but we simply need to include it, and we need to remove the barriers to doing that, both in a regulatory perspective, but also in a drug development perspective.
I have another question for you, Teresa. What's been the response from clinicians who are involved in this process? Are there any of them who feel as if involving patients sort of cuts them out in a new way?
Well, the clinicians that we've had at the meetings have primarily been the clinicians that work at FDA who also work in the clinic, but occasionally on some of and for some of the diseases, there have been a few doctors who may specialize in that disease. We've had a few diseases that are rare, where patients have had a difficult time getting the right diagnosis, in fact, that they have a given disease. And the clinicians who've been there have been very gratified, actually, to have their community of patients finally have an opportunity to talk, I think, as Mark said, about what it's like to live with the disease. We had a meeting on Chagas disease. It's actually a rare condition in the United States so far, but as more people immigrate from Latin America, we may find a greater incidence of Chagas. And the few patients we were able to find who are already symptomatic and know they have it had a very interesting message. Their message was, treat sooner. Look at Latin America, where people screen for this and treat it sooner so you don't become symptomatic. It causes tremendous damage to the heart. It's a parasitic disease. It causes tremendous damage to the heart. It's beginning to occur more in southern states where there are more immigrants. And so there they had the few doctors in the area who treat it, and they were very happy to hear about it. I think, as Mark's saying, we're finding that clinicians generally are finding this is extremely helpful to them. I mean, and they ask questions. They have an opportunity, the review divisions have an opportunity to directly ask patients, what would you like to see in a clinical trial? What is a meaningful endpoint? We've had two meetings on different types of cancer, and we've asked the question, what constitutes a meaningful benefit to you? What additional period of progression-free survival, what's meaningful to you? And then we get to hear about how the quality of life living with the therapy is very important, at least as important sometimes as extension of survival, but it can also depend on the circumstances of the patient's life. If it's a young mother with children and who has the cancer, she may be much more willing to tolerate the toxicities and do whatever it takes to survive and be there as long as possible for her children. If it's a person at a much later stage in their life, they may feel differently about it. So it's very important to also hear those differences. And I think what we understand is that the more we're able to pull this kind of perspective into the information that may be available, say in labeling, for prescribers and patients, they can have a richer discussion of these things when the doctor is talking and consulting with a particular patient. So that's where we see the downstream benefits of also trying to figure out how to collect this information in a more systematic way as part of the development program.
Sure. We don't have too much time left, so I do want to turn our attention to what's going on Capitol Hill and just go down the line. 21st Century Cures, the current discussion draft. What is your perspective on it? Does this cultural shift, is it going to be encouraged by that bill to a degree that you're happy with? And also looking forward to the next PDUFA reauthorization. We know that this is supposed to be a year of action on that. Jeff, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think there are certainly provisions in the current bill that are looking to enhance some of the good things that are already going on with regards to the patient-focused drug development. What the bill is seeking to do is to, in many ways, build on what's been learned from the first 14 meetings and operationalize it even more from both sides to help FDA provide clarity as to how they're going to use this information so that groups and patients that are participating in the meetings know how to prepare better, but also to provide a blueprint of sorts for patients themselves or patient advocacy organizations to gather rigorous data so that it is indeed usable and meaningful. And that's a challenge, but I think having the instruction book that is called for in the bill to be able to do this will help a lot of organizations that are that exist because they provide essential services to patients, but aren't necessarily designed to conduct research. But if they're given the pathway to do so, I think they'll be able to optimize their resources to collect data from all of the services they're providing patients in a scientifically rigorous manner and provide it back to researchers, drug developers, the FDA, to rapidly incorporate this type of information into drug development. I did also mention resources that patient groups would have to direct toward this type of research, but I think that's true for the FDA as well. And I hope that as this discussion continues that we see the necessary resources that could be provided to the agency to be able to be even more involved with these types of projects.
Sure, could be a big hurdle, we think, yeah. Margaret?
Absolutely. I agree with Jeff, and I think the current draft is a terrific addition to what's already been happening. I want to expand a little bit on what Jeff said, that I think we want to rely on those patient organizations that are in a position to do this type of data gathering. We've been doing an assessment of sort of the state of patient registries, and they run the gamut, right? Some of them look like a kind of a wedding guest book, and they call that a patient registry. Others are incredibly elaborate and pristine and something that everyone wants to emulate. So I think that we can rely on the patient organizations and some of the networks that are already up and running for some of this. But I want to also think about what role can industry play in that. There is already, as I said, very robust science going on within industry. And what we are experiencing, we have a Benefit Risk Advisory Council, Mark is a part of that, is industry doesn't want to get ahead of their skis in terms of kind of getting ahead of where the FDA is. Right. So I think there needs to be, a good meeting of the minds. And as I said, it's going to take all the sectors. So it's not just an FDA responsibility. But this is something that I think is a natural evolution, and I think everybody wants to get to this. It's a kind of a part of precision medicine too. On the resource issue, again, I'll echo what Jeff said. We have to be cognizant of what are we adding to the list for FDA, and appropriately, resource the agency for that. That's a complex issue because some of these things are not things that we want to wait around for. We do need to have some urgency about it. So I think that a lot of these different discussions that we're going to be having about, kind of what do we need now, what can we wait on? It's, sometimes it's like eating kale or something, it sounds like a great idea. I want that kale salad, but then you get it and you say, I don't know, this one wasn't so good. And we keep looking for the perfect one. So some of this is, not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that that's a dynamic going on, across the whole community, is everybody trying to figure out what's good enough and what gives us a great start. But we don't want to be kind of put behind when the momentum is so strong right now.
Sure. Mark?
So I completely agree with Margaret and Jeff. 3 points that I would add. There was a point in time back in the early 90s where I sat on a committee for Tufts University that was looking at whether or not the evidence supported regulating secondhand smoke. And there was research that showed that it was completely safe, usually funded by the tobacco industry, and research that said that this was a bad thing. And so we evaluated all the research and determined that the overwhelming weight of the evidence said that this was a bad thing. And I think you can see in this bill, it does so much. the overwhelming weight of this is incredibly supportive and will have long-term ramifications for the development of new, highly effective, valuable treatments. And I don't think we can underscore that enough. There's a lot in it. We sometimes get bogged down in the details, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of good stuff in it. I do want to say 3 things where there are opportunities for potential improvements. One is that the notion of engaging for the biopharmaceutical sector is something that has taken fire. But as Margaret said, industry doesn't want to get ahead of its skis. So largely because the attorneys are regulating the lawyers. And I think there's a challenge or a concern that if we engage patients, it could be perceived as marketing an unapproved product. And the bill, or the discussion draft, addresses that in many respects by saying that this data can be used by the FDA in benefit risk. Goes a long ways towards making it clear that this is different than marketing an unapproved product. It's a bilateral discussion so that you can understand preference and make higher value products. But I think we could go further to create safety and not let the lawyers dictate what can and cannot be done. There's a huge opportunity to gather a lot of great information. So that's one point where I think we can go further. A second is that we should create some sort of entity that will be a public-private consortia. And I know Faster Cures has been a leader in this space, but this is an area that is ripe to help both the biopharmaceutical sector and the patient community and the regulatory bodies, not just here in the US, but in Europe, to figure out how to do this and how to learn over the short term. And the third issue is looking at the incentives. Now, we've got rescue and repurposing in the discussion draft. That's an issue that has plagued our system for decades. Huge opportunity to correct that, but we haven't, in over 30 years, looked at the incentives to drive the development of high-value small molecules. And that was in the previous discussion draft. I think we as a country need to look at that issue and talk about what is it we want to incentivize. Not all medicines have the same value to public or to patients. And the incentives can change that dynamic. And we need to look at those 3 aspects as we move forward with this discussion draft.
Now, if we think about brass tacks, it does seem like a lot of it comes down to that resource discussion. And so I'm wondering from the 3 of you, particularly on the Senate side, given that we haven't seen as much activity there, what do you expect to see this year? And how are your groups engaging lawmakers in this discussion? Jeff?
I think the important thing that has started this discussion is there's certainly a will to get something done. We've heard it this morning. I think that both chambers are aligned in terms of the goal of focusing on this opportunity to enhance innovation. So at the outset, that's a good position to be in. I think it's anyone's guess as to what will be prioritized at the end out of both of these kind of parallel processes. But I think it's important to look at at what the goal is here, and it's not necessarily to in one fell swoop to transform the healthcare system. I don't think that was the goal of Chairman Upton. I don't think it will be the goal of Senator Alexander and the leaders in the Senate. But it's really to take the opportunity and respond to the state of science, because what we're seeing right now, not across the board, but in some different diseases, we are on a cusp of change in terms of where the science is driving. And so what this bill is starting to do is to prime the pump, essentially, and set up a framework that is prepared for this rapidly emerging technology, so that as we turn the corner toward innovative therapies and many of these gridlock diseases, that the system is prepared to accelerate it as fast as possible. So I think if we keep that motivation in mind, then hopefully the details will sort themselves out.
Margaret?
So I think that, to follow up on what Jeff said, when Faster Cures was created, people laughed at our name. Cures? What are you guys talking about? That's insane. How could you imagine cures? And I think we've seen some, right? And as Jeff is saying, the science is leading us towards dramatic, progress in multiple areas. And in areas that we need more science, I think that some of the legislative, proposals have put forward ideas for the NIH, which I don't want to leave out of this conversation, that, I do think that our back's against the wall a little bit in terms of some of these issues in the United States, that if we don't work on these things now, we run the risk of really ceding some of our, sort of good leadership in this life science arena. So I think that, as Jeff said, anything goes, but there is a real will towards this. I think, to hear two senators speaking about innovation the way that we did, that didn't happen, in the last several years. I think it's been a long time since we've had, Congress invested and interested in this issue. And I think it's really galvanized the stakeholder community. And I think it's caused conversations to happen that, wouldn't have happened this quickly otherwise. And I think, for that, we should all be excited. And, the ultimate goal is getting stuff down the line so that patients benefit, because there's a lot of people waiting.
Sure. Mark, final word?
The only two things I would add is that even if nothing else was done, the education throughout multiple stakeholder communities that has happened as a result of 21st century cures is huge. So a lot of what's in the bill could be done by the administration, by FDA, except for the issue of resources. But there are a lot of discussions happening now that are transforming what we're seeing in the development of new treatments. We still have a ways to go. The Senate is looking actively at a number of issues. I have the opportunity to sit on the Bipartisan Policy Commission that is making recommendations to the Senate on this very issue. That group is looking at many of the same issues that are in the 21st Century Cures discussion draft. I think what you're going to see is a convergence on a number of issues that address lots of different aspects that, again, collectively are going to have a huge impact. And at the end of the day, this is serving not just the public, individual patients. It creates better opportunities for innovators. If we get the resource issues right, better opportunities for NIH and FDA, this is a win for everybody.
Great. Well, thank you to our panel. I think we can all agree. Great discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we've proven that you can have a discussion on healthcare without having a fight break out this morning. I do want to thank all of our speakers, all our panelists, including the senators. I want to thank Pharma and John J. Castellani for sponsoring this event, as well as the museum, and all those who came this morning and who watched on thehill.com. Have a great day.